It was categorized into 5 categories: either not browsed at all, lightly browsed, moderately browsed, heavily browsed, or severely browsed. If you look here, you'll see that 68% of the trees that were sampled, the seedlings and saplings, were not browsed at all. When you combine the lightly browsed trees, you get 89% that were either not browsed or lightly browsed. Including moderately browsed, 96% of the regeneration was either not browsed, lightly browsed, or moderately browsed, leaving only 4% to be heavily or severely browsed. The conclusion in the report was that the deer herd was not reduced far enough or long enough. So what's going on? If the deer herd is not in bad health and the forest is not in bad health, what is really happening? In 2004, Dan Devlin, who is the chief forester for Pennsylvania, head of the Pennsylvania DCNR Bureau of Forestry, published this article in the Journal of Forestry. He designed a long-term forest management plan for the state, which is being implemented. It's to create old-growth forests on 1/4 or 1/2 of the state's forest lands. That's 500,000 to 1 million acres. Let me explain an old-growth forest. An old-growth forest is allowing the forest to grow to 250, 300, and 400 years old, a climax forest. Our great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren will not see the fruits of this effort. This would be like assuming that William Penn put together a forest management plan for Pennsylvania and it would still be in effect. Let me read here. Pennsylvania has embarked on establishing a 500,000 acre old-growth forest within its 2.1 million acres of state forest. The composition of many forests has been curtailed by deer overbrowsing. The result is that Pennsylvania faces a decades or even centuries-long gap before old-growth forests can function. Now, what I failed to tell you is the way that they're going to accomplish this is through elimination of the deer herd. Reducing Pennsylvania's deer population will likely require a long-term political process. This will not be easy. Remember, this political process, I'll come back to it a little later. In 2009, just last year, Dan Devlin, same state forester, called a conference of about a dozen scientists to evaluate the deer effects on the forest ecosystem. It was twofold. It was to discuss a new forest ecosystem concept, and a forest ecosystem concept is to enhance the forest system and create a dense understory rich in native wildflowers and non-game birds and mammals. The second thing is it's accomplished through the reduction of the deer herd. As you'll see here, State Forester Dan Devlin addressed the group about where the Pennsylvania Game Commission's Deer Management Assistant Program, deer map should be targeted. Conferees split into 2 backup sessions to discuss forest ecosystem management and deer ecosystem and deer management. Next. The participants, Merrick Grunn, remember that name? He was a former employee of the Game Commission. Benjamin Jones of the Game Commission. Roger Latham, he was the editor. He's one of the head people behind the ecosystem management philosophy. Roger Latham is the son of the Roger Latham that many of you are aware of. Chris Rosenberry, he's the head of the Game Commission's Deer Management Program. And Brian Schischler, a co-organizer. Remember that name. In 2009, recognize these names? Brian Schischler, Merrick Grunn, conducted a study through the Pinchot Institute. The goal of our study was to examine how other state wildlife agencies manage deer throughout the United States and to provide basic information about how deer could be managed from an ecosystem perspective in Pennsylvania. What he had discovered, thank you, Kim, is that most of the other states operated on what he called an agricultural paradigm, sustained yield, which I refer to in most biologists as maximum sustained yield. He used very derogatory terms in showing that how a farmer raises his cattle and livestock to produce a profit for his land and does it on a sustained basis, though, every year, so he doesn't destroy his land in doing it. What I realize is that this is how wildlife were successfully promoted in Pennsylvania for a half century. It's how we've gotten our food in America over the last 100 years, and it could be called the capitalist system. When an industry does it, they do it to maximize their profits. Continuing, from 2000 to 2003, Pennsylvania made substantial changes in their deer management program. In 2001, Audubon, Pennsylvania, and the Pennsylvania Habitat Alliance convened a group of scientists and policy experts to study how deer could be managed from an ecosystem perspective in Pennsylvania. It was written by Roger Latham, in 2005. I found that document. It's in DCNR files. It's a 362-page Audubon Bible for ecosystem management. In April 2001, Pennsylvania Office of the National Audubon Society and the Pennsylvania Habitat Alliance asked a group of professionals to look at deer management from an ecosystem perspective. In particular, the group was asked to describe how deer management might differ from current practices if deer were managed within an ecosystem framework that aims to conserve native biodiversity. This report, using Pennsylvania as an example, addresses the seriously degraded ecological condition of forests across much of the East, which has resulted in large part from high deer densities. The abundance of native wildflowers and other forest floor plants has been greatly diminished. Shrub species have been drastically decreased. Birds and other wildlife that depend on forest vegetation have also been affected. What this means is Audubon is promoting the new ecosystem management plan to increase understory vegetation, especially for native wildflowers and for non-game species of birds and mammals. The authors were Roger Latham, Merlin Benner, Merritt Grunn, remember that name? Brian Schischler, remember that name? And Cindy Adams Dunn, who is now with the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, DCNR, and who was former executive director of Audubon. There were others that were acknowledged. Ben Moyer. Ben Moyer is the outdoor writer of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Tim Schaefer, remember Tim Schaefer? He was the executive director of Audubon. He's now with the Pennsylvania Fish Commission. He's one of the men that walked in the proposal to Ed Schaefer from Audubon. And Susan Stout. Susan Stout is a member of the U.S. Forest Service. Of importance, which I wanted to show you, was those acknowledged from the Pennsylvania Game Commission for participating in this. And those who are acknowledged are Robert Boyd, Calvin DeBrock, Chris Rosenberry, and Vernon Ross.